The street lay under a pale autumn sky. A grey sheet of clouds stretched thin and trembling above the wooden facades of a town too small to matter on most maps. Dust drifted low, curling like smoke across boots, hitching in corners where the cold would soon press down. Nothing here was gentle, not the wind that cut through worn shawls, not the eyes of neighbours quick to cast judgment, and certainly not the heavy pillory standing before the sheriff's porch like a monument to cruelty. It was old wood, weathered and scarred, but the iron bolts still held firm, clamping slender wrists in a grip that had no mercy. She stood within it. Her name was Nia, though no one had bothered to ask. Her hair fell black and tangled, her face flushed with sun and streaked by tears that had dried too quickly in the air. At 23, her life should have been filled with promise. Instead, she had been reduced to a spectacle, a lesson on shame. Crowds had gathered all day, wagging tongues and pointing fingers. They said she had stolen beans from the trading post, though no one had seen her hand upon them. No trial, no proof. Just accusation carried on the current of distrust that ran between settlers and the Apache people. Men cursed at her. Women drew their children close and whispered warnings. Yet she did not bow her head. She stood tall in her torn deerskin dress, collarbone exposed from the roughness of her arrest, her bare feet planted in the dust, every muscle trembling, yet refusing to collapse. That quiet defiance unsettled some more than guilt would have. Still, hours dragged forward, and the ache of wood against her wrists grew sharper, burning lines across tender skin. The sky darkened. Fear crept in, not fear of punishment she could endure, but of what shadows might bring when the lamps of town flickered out. Fear of being left alone in the cold while laughter and warm meals filled every other room. Across the street, beneath the shade of the blacksmith's post, a man had been watching. He was taller than most, shoulders wide beneath a trail-worn coat. His hat brim dipped low, hiding eyes the color of steel weathered by storm. He had stood there for hours, boots sunk in dust, as if tethered to the sight of her. His name was Elias, a man marked by war, carrying in his body the limp of an old bullet, and in his silence the weight of memories too heavy to share. He told himself this was none of his affair. He had seen worse. Villages left in ruin, women abandoned to grief, children crying for fathers who never returned. He had hardened himself, learned to move on without pause. Yet something about the sight before him pried open a wound long sealed. The lines of suffering on her wrists were echoes of other faces. Other times he had been powerless to intervene. When the lamps of the saloon began to glow and the sheriff and deputy drifted inside, laughter leaking from swinging doors, the street grew still. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the hiss of wind through dry grass and the faint rattle of loose shutters. Elias shifted at last, boots crunching in the dirt as he crossed. His shadow stretched beside hers, tall and dark against the wooden frame. She turned her head, eyes wide but unblinking, lips cracked from thirst. The plea came not in a cry, but a whisper, hoarse, fragile, and yet it carried more weight than any shout. "Free me." The words slipped into his chest, a tremor that shook walls he had built too high for too long. He glanced once at the saloon, once at the sheriff's door. No one stirred. His hand went to the knife at his belt. The lock resisted, rusted tight, but he worked at it with quiet determination, until, with a groan, the board loosened. Her arms fell forward, numb, trembling like branches after storm. And she nearly collapsed, but his arms were there, catching her, steady as stone. She leaned into him, not in surrender, but in sheer exhaustion, her heart pounding against his chest, her breath shallow. For a moment, the world around them held still. No crowd, no judgment, no town, only the fragile truth of one soul released and another unwilling to walk away. They moved through the darkened edge of the street, his hand at her back, guiding each uncertain step. The pillory shrank behind them, swallowed by night, its shadow left for others to bear. Ahead stretched the dirt road, two ruts carved by wagon wheels, glowing faintly under the moon. The cottonwoods whispered as they passed, their branches bending to cover their escape. His horse waited where he had tied it, patient, ears flicking at the rustle of approaching figures. With care, he lifted her into the saddle, his hands gentle against the raw skin of her wrists. She winced, but said nothing, lips pressed tight, chin lifted in stubborn grace. Elias mounted behind, his arm steadying her slight frame as the horse shifted under their weight. Then they turned west, toward the hills, away from judgment and into the wide silence of the plains. The ride stretched long beneath a sky thick with stars. The cold air stung cheeks, but the rhythm of hooves carried them forward, a healing cadence in the night. Nia's body swayed, heavy with fatigue, yet every time she faltered, he steadied her without word, his presence like a shield. He thought of the cabin waiting 6 miles ahead, a place meant for solitude, built for one man alone. Tonight, it would hold 2 lives bound suddenly by fate. He had not planned for company, had not planned for risk. But as he felt her heartbeat echo faint against his arm, he knew there had never been another choice. When at last the cabin appeared, a dark outline against the slope, he helped her down, her bare feet brushing the frosted earth. She followed without resistance, guided by his strength, the faint light of his lamp revealing rough walls, a small hearth, a bed too simple to offer much but warmth. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and coffee, left long unused. He set her on a stool by the stove, filled a tin cup with water, and placed it into her trembling hands. She drank quickly, water slipping down her chin, eyes wide with relief, yet cautious still, as if afraid to trust too much. He wiped her wrists with cool cloth, the sting easing, and for the first time her breathing slowed. He gestured to the bed. She hesitated, brows furrowed in doubt. Why would he offer her rest when the world had shown her only cruelty? He answered with a simple truth. "You've stood long enough." Gratitude softened her gaze, a flicker of warmth breaking through. She lay down, pulling the blanket close, while he sat by the fire, shoulders heavy yet calm for the first time in years. Outside, the wind pressed against shutters, but within these walls there was stillness, fragile yet real. He did not sleep deeply, hand near the rifle, but each time his eyes lifted toward her resting form, something like peace touched him. Dawn broke pale, frost silvering the grass beyond the cabin. She stirred first, wrapped in the blanket, watching the fire's glow. He rose, joints aching, and found her eyes upon him, not filled with fear, but with the quiet resilience of someone who had survived the longest night. She whispered she could leave, that he owed her nothing. He shook his head, voice steady. "Not yet. Safer here." Trust was not built overnight, But in that silence, something shifted, a healing thread woven between two lives once frayed. The day passed slow. He fetched water from the well, expecting perhaps she would vanish, slip away like so many others who could not bear to stay. But when he returned, she was still there, hair loose around her shoulders, the blanket folded with care. She washed in silence, the simple act filling the cabin with a sense of life it had long lacked. He offered her one of his shirts, rough but warm, and when she asked if he trusted her, he answered plainly. If she had meant to flee, she would have already gone. She accepted, slipped the fabric over her frame, and sat at the table, her presence filling the room with a quiet belonging. Over eggs cooked in a worn pan, she admitted she had been hungry, accused without reason, cast aside because her skin marked her different. He listened, nodding, anger simmering low but steady. She confessed no place waited for her. The truth hung heavy between them. Two lives adrift, finding shore in each other's company. That night, as the fire cracked low, he sat near the door while she lay on the bed, her breathing softer now. The storm of fear had not vanished, but the first rays of something gentler broke through. Love does not always arrive with grand declarations. Sometimes it is in the offering of water, the mending of torn cloth, the watching through long hours so another may sleep in peace. It is in the healing of silence, the warmth of a small room against the endless cold. And as dawn came again, he knew he had chosen not only to save her, but to let himself be saved by the fragile beginning they had sparked together. Every listener who follows this tale carries a part of it within, the longing for shelter, the courage to defend, the miracle of finding trust where none seemed possible. If you feel these words touch a corner of your own heart, let that resonance be known. Share your thoughts, leave a comment, offer a quiet sign of support, as one might place a stone upon a riverbank to mark the path. A simple act, like subscribing or adding your voice, is not just for numbers. It is the way stories continue, healing and warm, reminding us that none of us stands alone in the cold. And so their story does not end with rescue, but flows onward, into days where fences must be mended, storms endured, and choices faced. For now, though, in that cabin of firelight and fragile trust, the seed of love had been planted, ready to grow against all odds. And as the night deepened once more, the world outside indifferent, within those walls hope took root, gentle and unyielding, waiting to unfold into something far greater. The morning widened slowly, light spilling in threads through the single window of the cabin, painting the air with muted gold. Elias rose first, his body heavy with the ache of years and nights kept half awake. But something was different now. He was no longer waking to silence alone. Nia sat at the edge of the bed, the blanket folded carefully beside her, her dark hair loose, catching the light as though dawn itself had chosen her shoulders to rest upon. She had not vanished in the night, had not stolen into the trees. She was here, and her quiet presence filled the cabin with a stillness that felt almost like healing. She followed him outside, feet fitted into the two large boots he had given her, the leather loose around her ankles, but better than bare skin against frost. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of earth washed clean by dew. He led her to the fence line, where rails sagged and nails bent with age. His land stretched wide, pale grass whispering under the cold wind, cottonwoods standing sentinel in the distance. He showed her how to brace the posts, while he hammered iron into place. At first, her hands fumbled, fingers raw and clumsy, but her gaze was steady, unyielding. She learned quickly, finding rhythm in the strike of hammer and the weight of wood. Sweat gathered on her brow, and yet she did not complain. She moved with the same stubborn grace that had kept her upright in the pillory, as though to yield now would betray herself. By the third section, she matched his pace. He stole a glance at her, catching the faint curve of pride hidden at the corner of her mouth, subtle but real. Something warm settled within him, a gentle reassurance that she was not only surviving, but beginning to stand whole again. He said little, but when the final rail held firm, he told her she had done well. She gave the smallest nod, but her eyes flickered with light, and he carried that quiet flame with him as they walked back toward the cabin. Inside, the stove's heat welcomed them. She pulled her legs under herself as she sat, as though the place were already becoming a home she dared to inhabit. He stripped off his sweat-damp shirt, reaching for a clean one, and in the silence between them he felt her eyes. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw it. Not fear, but something softer, something unspoken. He spoke of the town, of how they would soon notice she was missing. Her hand tightened around the tin cup at that, her eyes shadowed with the knowledge that safety was fragile. He told her simply he would do the same thing tomorrow that he had done yesterday. Her gaze lingered on him, steady, and in that silence something stronger than words was exchanged. The afternoon drifted with ease. She found a sewing kit on the shelf, her slender fingers threading needle and mending the torn edges of her dress. He worked leather straps for a bridle, the sound of thread pulling through fabric mingling with the creak of leather. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter for one. It felt shared, filled with the pulse of two lives creating small acts of order in the midst of chaos. At one point, she looked up, eyes thoughtful, and asked why he was here, away from towns and men. He told her the truth, because there was little left for him anywhere else. Her answer was quiet, yet it cut deep. Now she knew his name, and it would not let him vanish so easily. When the sun dipped low, they stoked the fire high. Shadows curled along the walls, and the air inside glowed with warmth. She sat by the flames, knees drawn close, the shirt he had given her hanging loose, her hair unbraided and dark against her shoulders. He watched her, and something stirred that he had long kept locked away. The room seemed smaller then, not with confinement, but with closeness. She met his eyes, and though neither spoke, the air thickened with an understanding too fragile to name. He told her she could rest, that he would keep watch, but she lingered by the fire longer, unwilling to let the quiet break. Only when the flames eased into embers did she lie down, her face turned toward him in the dim glow. Their eyes held across the hush, two exiles bound by silence, and the world outside fell away. The next morning the sky carried the scent of rain. Clouds gathered heavy on the horizon, and the wind shifted low and restless. Together they closed shutters, fastened latches, prepared for the storm. She moved through the cabin not as a guest, but as though her hands belonged there, her steps leaving traces of belonging. He watched her without meaning to, the way her braid swung over her shoulder, the way she pressed boards into place with quiet determination. By dusk, the storm broke. Rain lashed the roof. Thunder rolled so fierce it rattled the walls. She sat close to the fire, arms wrapped around herself, every crash of thunder drawing tension through her body. He crossed to her side, voice steady, hand resting on her shoulder. She did not shrug him away. She turned toward him, eyes wide and searching, and in the glow of the firelight their faces drew close. Her question came soft, almost lost in the storm's roar. Why did he care? He could have lied, but truth pressed too strong, because he had seen too many left behind, because he would not leave her to the cold. Her eyes shifted then, the guarded distance loosening. Her hand rose, tentative, brushing his wrist. Time stilled. The kiss that followed was gentle, cautious, but real. The first breaking of a barrier neither had dared admit was there. When he pulled back, her breath was quick, her hand still resting lightly against him, and though words faltered, the silence was full of promise. They slept at last, with the storm easing beyond the walls, the fire's glow dimming to embers. For the first time in years, Elias let himself drift without fear of what the night might bring. Beside him, Nia's presence softened the weight of solitude, and the cabin, once only a shelter, had become a haven of warmth, a space of healing where something new had begun to grow. The dawn that followed carried not only the smell of wet earth, but the fragile certainty of change. She rose with him, her face calm, though her eyes still wary of what might come. Together they fetched water, repaired rails, shared quiet meals. Step by step, day by day, their lives intertwined, not by sudden passion alone, but by the gentle rhythm of survival shared. And though the sheriff's shadow loomed beyond the horizon, within these walls there was a seed of belonging, waiting to rise even against the fiercest winds. The land after the storm was washed clean, air heavy with the perfume of wet earth, the grass bowed under droplets that shimmered like scattered pearls. Elias rose early, stepping outside to breathe the cold into his lungs, and for a moment he felt something close to peace, a healing stillness that was rare in his life. When he returned, Nia was already awake, sitting near the stove with the blanket folded neatly beside her, her hair braided down her back. She looked different in the morning light, less like a fugitive, more like someone beginning to belong to herself again. They shared breakfast in silence, forks tapping tin plates, the sound of rainwater dripping from the eaves the only other voice in the room. When she rose, she offered to fetch water from the well. He hesitated, then let her go, watching through the window as she crossed the yard, the oversized boots sinking into soft earth. She moved carefully, straight-backed, eyes scanning the tree line with the wariness of one who had never been allowed to trust the world. When she returned, her arms trembled under the weight of the bucket, but she did not falter. He took it from her hands gently, setting it near the stove, telling her she didn't need to carry everything alone. Her reply was simple, quiet, but filled with truth. She knew. The day passed with a rhythm new to both of them. They walked the fence line together, tightening rails loosened by the storm, her hands learning to test each post, her feet steady beside his. She asked about his past, her voice soft, and he answered honestly. He told her he had been a soldier once, that he had fought her people because he was ordered to. Her eyes held his then, steady and unreadable, before she asked if he regretted it. His answer came without hesitation. Every day. The silence that followed was not a wound, but a balm. She nodded slowly, and in her gaze there was no judgment, only recognition of truth. That evening she cooked supper herself, stirring beans with quiet focus, the scent filling the small cabin. He watched her, not correcting, not guiding, just letting her move as though she had always been meant to stand by the stove. They ate together as the sun bled orange across the hills. The meal was simple, but it carried with it the weight of a new beginning, a healing act that spoke louder than words. Later, as the fire settled into steady glow, she mended the last tear in her dress. He polished his rifle, the sound of cloth against metal mingling with the soft pull of thread. The air between them had shifted. It was no longer silence, heavy with distrust, but quiet companionship, the kind that soothed instead of strained. When night fell, he moved to take the chair near the door, but her voice stopped him. She told him he need not sit awake through the night, that she was not afraid any more. For a long moment he stood frozen, then nodded, removing his boots and lying beside her. The bed was narrow, the blanket thin, but the nearness of her was enough. She turned onto her side, her back to him, but when her hand brushed lightly against his arm in sleep, he felt tension leave his body as though something inside him had been healed. Morning came crisp, the sky painted pale blue. Yet beneath its calm, Elias felt the weight of trouble pressing closer. The sheriff would not have forgotten. Towns do not forgive what they see as defiance. Still, the days stretched in fragile peace. Nia began to move about the cabin as though it was partly hers, her mended dress hanging neat by the fire, her boots by the door, her dark hair brushed smooth each morning. She practiced with the rifle in the afternoons, Elias teaching her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to find steadiness in breath. At first the recoil startled her, but she did not surrender. Each shot grew stronger, each step a reclaiming of her own strength. He watched her, pride stirring in him as her eyes lit with a new fire. She was no longer simply someone to protect. She was becoming someone who could stand beside him. One evening, when the last light clung to the horizon, she set the rifle back against the wall with care and asked him why he had never stayed anywhere before. His hands paused over leather straps he had been mending. He admitted he had always run, from war, from men, from memories that clung too sharp. She studied him for a moment, then touched his arm deliberately, her fingers warm against his skin. She told him softly that perhaps this was where he could stop running. Her words sank deep, deeper than he expected, stirring something long dormant. That night the cabin felt different, heavier, not with fear, but with possibility. She moved close, her eyes clear, her choice unmistakable. When he reached to touch her cheek, she leaned into his hand without hesitation. Their kiss was deeper this time, unhurried, certain. The fire glowed low, the shadows long, and the world outside ceased to matter. For the first time in years, Elias felt not like a wanderer passing through, but like a man who had found ground solid enough to plant roots. The following days passed in a rhythm that felt like healing woven into routine. They mended fences, chopped wood, gathered water, shared meals. At night they lay together not because of fear or necessity, but because they wanted to. He began to sleep without waking at every sound, her breathing steady beside him like a lullaby that eased wounds he thought would never close. And she began to smile, faint at first, but unguarded, her eyes softening in ways they never had when he first saw her bound in wood and iron. But peace is fragile, and the world beyond their door had not forgotten. Late one morning, the sound of hoofbeats carried on the cold air, sharp and certain. Elias set down the wood he had been stacking and straightened slowly. his hand brushing instinctively against the rifle. Nia stepped onto the porch, her face tightening when she heard it too. He told her to stay inside, but she hovered near the window, eyes following him as he stepped into the yard. The sheriff rode into view, his deputy at his side, their horses stamping in the frost. Their eyes carried the weight of accusation, and the silence before words was heavy with threat. Elias stood firm, rifle resting steady across his arms, his body unmoving as stone. The sheriff called out, his tone almost casual, but his meaning sharp. Word had spread. The town wanted her back. She was accused, and by their judgment, her place was the pillory, or worse. Elias's voice came calm but resolute. She would not go back. He told them what they called trial was nothing but a hanging, dressed in false words. The deputy sneered, spitting his venom into the dirt, calling her nothing more than Apache skin. Elias's jaw tightened, but his stance never shifted. He raised the rifle, not aimed at their hearts, but steady enough to make the meaning clear. She stays. His words cut through the cold, carried on air like steel. The sheriff studied him, eyes narrowing. For a long breath the yard held still, only the creak of saddles and the hiss of wind filling the space. Finally, with a shake of his head, the sheriff turned his horse. He told Elias he was making enemies that the town would not forget. Elias's reply was simple, even it would not be the first time. When they rode off, the sound of hooves fading into distance, Elias lowered his rifle and turned toward the cabin. Nia was there, standing in the doorway, pale but unbroken. She whispered that they would come again, and he admitted they might. Yet in that moment, as her hand reached to touch his arm, her eyes steady on his, he knew the choice had already been made. Whatever came, they would face it together. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, but warmth lingered, a warmth not only of flame, but of trust. For the first time, Nia's gaze held not fear, not gratitude alone, but the beginning of something freer, the certainty of belonging. Their days would not be easy. The world beyond still hostile, but within these walls healing had taken root, and love, fragile yet fierce, had begun to bloom. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm that felt both fragile and whole, a kind of quiet life stitched together from work, silence, and the steady warmth of companionship. Nia no longer lingered at the edges of the cabin like a guest uncertain of her place. She moved with assurance now, laying wood by the fire, folding blankets, mending seams, fetching water without being asked. Elias watched her, sometimes pretending not to, and each small gesture became a thread binding the space between them tighter. The cabin had once been a place of exile, a shelter for a man who sought no company. Now, with her presence, it breathed like a living thing, carrying the healing energy of belonging. Mornings began with shared work. They would step into the pale light together, boots crunching over frost as they walked the pasture. He showed her how to test wire along the fence, how to drive nails straight, how to listen for the creak of posts that needed bracing. Her hands grew calloused, her movements stronger. She no longer asked whether she could help. She simply stood beside him, her body carrying the quiet pride of learning to endure. By midday they returned to the cabin, their clothes marked with dust and sweat, but their faces carrying the calm that comes when two lives move in rhythm. Afternoons were given to practice. Elias set a board against the cottonwoods and placed the rifle in her hands. He guided her stance, his palms steadying her shoulders, his voice low in her ear. The first shots had jolted her, but she grew accustomed to the recoil, each crack of gunpowder echoing confidence into her bones. He corrected gently, never harsh, and each time she improved, he gave the smallest nod, the kind of affirmation that weighed more than 1,000 words. By the 5th day, she struck the center of the board, and when she looked to him, the quiet pride in her eyes mirrored his own. Evening settled into something softer. Supper simmered on the stove, while the fire painted the cabin with light. Sometimes they spoke about her childhood memories of desert winds, about his years in the army, about the silence that followed him long after the war. Sometimes they did not speak at all, letting the comfort of presence fill the space where words were unnecessary. The quiet no longer carried distance. It was healing silence, the kind that soothed instead of separated. The first true smile came one evening when she caught him staring across the table. It was faint, a curve of her lips she seemed almost shy to release, but it broke something open inside him. He answered with a rare smile of his own, one that felt awkward after so many years locked away. They laughed softly at their own clumsiness, and that sound lingered, warm, in the cabin's air long after the fire dimmed. One night, as rain whispered against the shutters, she placed her sewing aside and crossed to where he sat cleaning his rifle. She stood near him, her presence quiet but deliberate. He looked up, and she held his gaze without hesitation. Her hand touched his arm, light but steady, and her words were simple. Perhaps this was the place he could finally stop running. He did not answer immediately, but the truth of it sank deep into him, into wounds that had never healed. He reached for her then, his hand resting against her cheek, and she leaned into the touch with the certainty of someone who had already chosen. Their kiss was slow, lingering, filled not with urgency, but with the quiet depth of trust. It was not a beginning marked by passion alone, but by the healing power of knowing they no longer faced the world alone. From then, their nights changed. They shared the bed, not out of necessity, but out of desire for closeness. The warmth of her body beside his softened years of solitude, and his steady presence quieted the shadows of her fear. They slept with breaths aligned, the fire's glow painting their faces, and the cabin that had once been a fortress of solitude became a sanctuary of tenderness. Yet peace never holds forever. The hoofbeats came again, sharper this time, breaking into the calm morning air. Elias was ready. He had been expecting it since the sheriff's first visit. The rifle was clean, loaded, leaning by the door. He stepped outside before they reached the yard, Nia standing just inside, her eyes following through the sliver of window. The sheriff came with 2 more men, not only the deputy. Their faces were hard, their eyes carrying the certainty of men who believed they carried the law with them. They dismounted, boots crunching against frozen ground, hands near their weapons. The sheriff called out, voice sharper than before. The town demanded her return, he said. They accused Elias of harboring a fugitive. They questioned why a man like him would risk so much for a girl like her. Elias stood firm, the rifle steady in his hands but not yet raised. His voice cut across the air, even and calm. The law they spoke of was no justice. She had done nothing to deserve hanging. She would stay here. The deputy sneered, throwing poison into the wind, asking if Elias meant to make her his woman. The insult stung, but Elias did not flinch. He replied only that what lay between him and her was no man's business but theirs. The sheriff demanded proof of her choice. If she wished to stay, she must say it herself. Elias turned slightly, calling her name, and Nia stepped onto the porch. She wore her mended dress, her hair braided neatly, her chin high despite the cold biting her bare feet. Her voice rang clear, steady, despite the weight pressing against her. She would stay. No one in town owned her. No one had the right to put her back in chains. For a moment, the yard held silence, the words hanging heavier than the wind. The sheriff studied her, then Elias, before giving a slow nod. His warning was sharp. Neither of them would be welcome in town again. But Elias only replied they would get by. With that, the sheriff turned, mounting his horse, and the men rode off, leaving the cabin standing firm against the wide emptiness of the land. When the last sound of hooves faded, Elias lowered his rifle. Nia stood in the doorway, her body tense, but her eyes carried a fierce light. She told him quietly that he had given up the town for her. His answer came steady. There had been nothing there worth holding on to. This place, this cabin, this fragile life they had built, this was enough. Her hand touched his chest, resting above the beat of his heart, and her words came like a balm. It was enough for her too. Inside, the fire burned low, the room steeped in warmth that was no longer borrowed but theirs. Nia moved with ease now, pouring coffee into mugs, placing one before him at the table. Her steps carried no hesitance, only the assurance of belonging. When she sat across from him, her smile was unguarded, soft and real. Elias watched her, his hand reaching across the table to rest on hers. For the first time in years, he spoke words not edged by survival, but softened by hope. She could stay. Her answer came simple, steady, and certain. She already had. That night they shared the bed not as fugitives or as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two souls who had chosen each other. Outside, the stars glittered cold against the sky, but inside the cabin the fire glowed steady, its warmth matched by the quiet rhythm of their hearts. For Elias, it was the first time since before the war that he felt something beyond endurance. He felt the healing peace of a beginning. And for Nia, who had once stood in chains before a jeering crowd, it was the first time she felt not like a lesson in shame, but like a woman free to love, to stay, to build. Together they lay beneath the thin blanket, and though the world beyond might threaten storms again, within those four walls they had carved a sanctuary of tenderness, unbroken and whole, ready to face whatever came with unyielding grace. The rhythm of their days deepened, each one layering gently upon the last, until life itself felt like a quilt of small, steadfast moments. Nia no longer carried herself with the rigid wariness of someone ready to flee at any breath. She moved with quiet assurance, her touch woven into the fabric of the cabin, her mended dress folded near the fire, her boots set neatly by the door, her braid trailing over her shoulder as she worked. Elias, who had long grown accustomed to silence as a shield, began to hear new sounds, her humming while she cooked, her soft laughter when he muttered at stubborn nails, her calm breathing beside him at night. These sounds healed corners of his soul that had been left barren for too many years. Their work together became ritual. At dawn they stepped into the pale light, the world stretched wide before them. The fence line needed mending still, and though her hands grew sore, Nia refused to falter. She matched his pace, her brow furrowed in determination, her lips pressed firm. Elias watched her learn to brace her weight, to strike nails true, to stand steady despite the wind that pressed against them both. He admired not only her strength, but the resilience that glowed beneath her skin, the resilience of a woman who had endured shame and still stood tall. When the final post held, she straightened, wiping dust from her brow, and the faintest smile lifted her mouth. That smile, rare and unguarded, filled Elias with warmth that lingered longer than fire. Afternoons belonged to her training. With the rifle against her shoulder, she learned to breathe slow, to steady her heartbeat with the pull of the trigger. At first the recoil jolted her frame, but she did not yield. As she steadied herself, eyes narrowing, and each shot struck closer to the center of the board. Elias corrected her gently, his voice low, his hands guiding without force. She accepted his touch without flinching, her trust deepening with each lesson. By the 7th day, when the crack of gunpowder rang through the cottonwoods and her bullet struck clean, she turned to him, her face glowing with pride. He nodded, a small gesture, yet his chest swelled with quiet admiration. Evenings grew into something softer, a healing balm after labor and strain. Nia would sit by the stove, mending clothes or braiding her hair, while Elias shaped wood, sharpened blades, or polished his rifle. Sometimes they spoke of memories, her childhood under desert skies, the smell of sage after rain, the songs her mother once sang. Sometimes he told her of long marches across plains, of battles that left scars not only on his body, but carved deep in his mind. She listened, her gaze steady, her silence never judgmental. Other times they did not speak at all, letting their presence weave comfort stronger than words. On one evening when the firelight painted her face in gold, Elias caught himself staring. Her hair, loose now, spilled over her shoulder, her eyes reflecting flame. She noticed his gaze, but instead of turning away, she held it. The air between them shifted, heavy yet tender. She set aside the fabric in her hands, crossed the space, and placed her palm lightly against his cheek. Her touch was warm, healing in its simplicity. He leaned into it, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel what he had denied for years. When their lips met, it was not with haste, but with a tenderness born from survival, from the knowledge that love could grow even in the soil of sorrow. Nights thereafter carried new closeness. They lay together not as strangers, not as protector and rescued, but as two souls who had chosen each other. The narrow bed no longer felt small. It became a sanctuary, a space where his rough edges softened and her guarded walls fell away. She slept with her face near his chest, her breathing slow and steady, while his arms circled her lightly, a promise unspoken but sure. In those hours, the storms of the outside world could not reach them, yet beyond their walls, whispers stirred. The sheriff had returned once, and though he had left, Elias knew the town would not let the matter rest. Trouble carried on the wind, pressing closer each day. Still, life continued. Nia gathered herbs by the creek, her hands deft as she sorted them on the table. Elias chopped wood, the sound echoing steady across the clearing. At night they shared quiet meals, her cooking filling the cabin with warmth. Each act, though ordinary, became extraordinary in its healing power, binding them to a rhythm neither had thought possible. It was during one such evening, when the fire cast shadows long across the cabin floor, that Nia spoke of fear. Not fear of the sheriff or the town, but of being left again. Her voice trembled slightly as she confessed how often life had taken from her. Family lost, trust broken, shelter denied. Elias listened, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, silence lingered, heavy with the weight of her pain. Then he reached for her hand, pressing it against his chest. He told her without flourish, without grand words, that he had run from many things in his life, but he would not run from her. Her tears came silent, glistening as they traced her cheeks, but her grip on his hand tightened. In that moment, something broke open and healed at once. She leaned into him, and he held her, not as savior, but as man to woman, heart to heart. The fire crackled, the storm outside their lives pressed at the edges, but inside the cabin there was warmth enough to push it away. The following days carried that tenderness into everything they did. She walked with him to the pasture, her braids swinging against her back. He taught her how to guide the horse, how to read the clouds for coming storms. She taught him the songs of her people, low and rhythmic, sung as they mended fence or gathered water. Her voice, soft yet strong, seemed to weave itself into the very air, filling the clearing with peace. Elias found himself humming along, the unfamiliar melody becoming his own. It was as if their lives had begun to blend into one song, carrying the cadence of healing through every hour. Still, danger returned as sure as dawn. One morning the sound of hooves thundered again. This time more than 2 riders. Elias stepped outside, his rifle ready, while Nia stood near the door, her face pale but her spine straight. The sheriff arrived with 3 men, their eyes cold, their mouths sharp with accusation. They demanded her return, said the town would not abide her sheltering with him. Elias's voice rang firm across the yard. She was not leaving. The sheriff insisted she speak. Elias turned to her, and Nia stepped forward, her bare feet pressing into the frozen boards of the porch. She lifted her chin and declared her choice, her voice steady. She would not return. She belonged here, not in chains. The men shifted, unsettled by her strength. The sheriff gave his final warning, declaring them outcasts from the town. Elias answered simply that they would survive. The riders left, their figures shrinking into distance. The silence that followed was thick, but it did not choke. Nia turned to Elias, her eyes fierce, her body trembling with the force of her declaration. She told him softly that he had given up the town for her. He replied that the town had never given him anything worth holding. She was what mattered now. Inside, the fire burned bright. They sat across from each other, coffee warming their hands, silence between them gentle and whole. He reached for her hand, and she gave it freely. For the first time, Elias felt he had stopped running. For the first time, Nia felt she had a place where she was more than a lesson in shame. Together, in that cabin, their hearts had found shelter. That night, they lay close, the fire glowing steady, their bodies wrapped not just in blanket, but in the certainty of choice. The world outside might one day press harder, but within these walls they had carved a sanctuary that no sheriff, no town, no storm could take away. And as dawn touched the horizon, Elias watched Nia sleeping, her face softened in peace, her hair spread across the pillow. He whispered to himself words that needed no answer. She was home. The snow began to fall in earnest, covering the earth in white silence, and the cabin grew smaller each day as the cold pressed tighter around its wooden walls. Yet within, warmth thrived. Elias had thought of winter once as a season of endurance, a battle against hunger, cold, and the loneliness of long nights. Now it felt transformed. With Nia beside him, winter became a season of shelter, of shared firelight, of quiet healing. Each log he split carried her laughter as she gathered the kindling. Each pot of stew simmering on the stove was flavored not just with herbs, but with companionship. The harshness of the outside world softened, dulled by the comfort of knowing he no longer faced it alone. Nia adjusted quickly to the rhythm of cold days. She woke with him, wrapped herself in his shirt and her mended dress layered against the chill, and moved through the cabin with an assurance that had not been there when she first arrived. She swept snow from the porch, hung herbs near the rafters, and tended to small tasks with diligence. She was no longer the woman who had stood chained in the pillory. She was someone who had taken the broken edges of her life and begun to weave them into something whole. Elias noticed the strength in her step, the way her shoulders no longer bent under invisible weight. He saw the light growing in her eyes, and it warmed him more than the fire ever could. Some days the storm raged so fiercely they could not step outside. They sat together, side by side at the table, or near the hearth, while the wind rattled the shutters. Elias carved small pieces of wood, shaping them into figures of horses or birds, while Nia mended blankets or ground herbs into powders. Their hands moved separately, but the rhythm was the same, steady and sure. At times she hummed low, songs from her people, threads of melody that carried the scent of desert winds and starlit nights. Elias listened, his chest tightening, not from sorrow, but from the healing peace of her voice. In those moments, he felt something he had not known in years, a sense of home that was not tied to walls or land, but to a presence. At night, the intimacy between them grew deeper. They no longer lay beside each other as if afraid to cross a line. Her body fit against his, her head resting beneath his chin, her breath warming his skin. His hand would find hers in the dark, fingers entwining naturally, as though their lives had been waiting for this touch. The fire's glow painted their faces, the shadows dancing across walls, and the silence was rich with unspoken words. She had begun to trust his embrace, not as rescue, but as belonging, and he had begun to believe that his wandering had always been leading here, to this bed, to this woman, to this healing. One evening, while the storm roared outside, she asked him to tell her of his past. His hand stilled on the carving knife, his breath catching. For years he had buried it, the marches, the battles, the villages burning, the cries that haunted him in sleep. But with her eyes steady on his, he found himself speaking. His voice was low, carrying the weight of memories, yet her hand upon his arm steadied him. He confessed the things he had done under orders, the regrets that gnawed at him, the reason he had fled the army to lose himself in solitude. When he finished, silence pressed heavy between them. Then Nia leaned forward, her hand against his cheek, her lips soft against his brow. She whispered that he carried sorrow, but he was not the sum of those sins. He was the man who had freed her, the man who had chosen to stand when others turned away. Her words settled in him like balm, easing wounds he had thought permanent. In return, he asked her of her own life. She spoke quietly, telling him of a family scattered, of hunger gnawing at her stomach until she could not stand straight, of the cruelty she had endured in silence because pleading only made men laugh. Yet as she spoke, her eyes did not dim. They shone with resilience, with a pride that had carried her even into shame and out again. Elias listened, his heart aching, his chest swelling with admiration. She had been denied dignity, but she had not lost herself. He promised, with no grand gesture but with the quiet certainty of his voice, that she would never stand alone again. When the storm finally broke, the land lay glittering under sunlight, the snow unbroken, pure as untouched canvas. Elias saddled the horse, and together they rode across the white plain. The wind was sharp, but the air smelled clean, and the world stretched vast and silent. Nia leaned into him, her body warm against his, her hair brushing his jaw. They did not speak, for the ride itself was enough. The horizon was endless, but neither felt lost. They had found their place, their direction, not in geography, but in each other. Returning to the cabin, Nia surprised him by preparing supper without asking, her movements sure, her hands confident. Elias sat at the table, watching as she stirred the pot, her hair slipping from its braid, her face lit by firelight. He thought then that this was what peace looked like, not absence of danger, but presence of love. When she set the bowl before him, she smiled faintly, unguarded. He reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers, and in that simple gesture the weight of years seemed to fall away. That night they lay in bed, closer than ever. Her fingers traced the scars on his chest, each mark a story he had never wanted to tell. But now, with her, he found he could. She listened, not with pity, but with understanding. When she pressed her lips to one scar, his breath shuddered, and he felt not shame, but healing. He held her then, and their bodies joined not only in passion, but in a unity that felt sacred. Outside, the stars glittered cold, but inside, warmth blazed, filling the small cabin with life. The days that followed carried the same rhythm, yet each one deepened the bond between them. Elias no longer thought of himself as a man alone. He thought of her first when he woke, last when he closed his eyes, and in every quiet moment between. Nia no longer thought of herself as a prisoner of fate. She thought of him as proof that love could bloom even in the harshest soil. Together they moved through the season not as broken souls clinging to survival, but as two hearts entwined, carrying the healing weight of belonging. The sheriff's shadow still lingered in the distance, the threat of town never gone, but the fear no longer consumed them. They had chosen each other, and in that choice lay strength. Whatever came would be faced side by side. And for now, as firelight glowed upon their faces, as the warmth of shared breath filled the night, they lived in the fullness of love, whole and unbroken. The snow melted slow in the turning of the season, water trickling down from the ridges to feed the creek that wound behind the cabin. Days lengthened, light spilling later across the hills, and with the change came a sense of renewal neither Elias nor Nia could ignore. What had begun as survival was now a life woven together with quiet intention. The cold that once kept them near the fire gave way to soft breezes, and the air filled with scents of thawed earth, pine, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers daring to bloom. They worked side by side with a steadiness born of trust. Elias mended harness straps while Nia planted herbs in the patch of soil near the cabin, her fingers pressing seeds into the damp ground. She told him plants would grow stronger if spoken to kindly, and he caught himself watching the way her lips moved when she murmured to the earth as though coaxing life into being. He had long believed the land unforgiving, yet in her hands even the hardest ground seemed willing to heal. At dusk, when the wind softened, they walked the fence line together. Her hand brushed his as they moved, sometimes curling into his for a few steps before releasing again, not from shyness, but because the silence between them held more tenderness than words could carry. Evenings grew rich with warmth. Supper bubbled on the stove, often seasoned with herbs she had coaxed from the soil, while the fire painted the cabin in gold. Elias would tell her stories of the road, not of battles this time, but of quiet nights spent under stars, of rivers crossed, of horses he had trusted more than men. She listened, her chin resting on her hand, her eyes deep with attention. When she spoke of her own memories, her mother's songs, the way desert light touched stone at dusk, her voice filled the cabin like prayer. Together they created a world stitched from fragments of past pain and present peace, a world that healed even as it grew. At night, their closeness was no longer tentative. They had grown into each other, their bodies finding rhythm as naturally as breath. The bed that once felt narrow now seemed boundless, for in the circle of his arms and the warmth of her touch there was no boundary left. Sometimes they whispered in the darkness, dreams of what could be, hopes neither had dared to voice before. Other times they said nothing at all, letting the simple sound of shared breathing carry them into sleep. Each night Elias felt his old restlessness loosen further, as if every touch of her hand untied another knot in him. Each morning Nia woke with the calm glow of someone who had finally found safe ground. Still, the shadow of the town pressed near. The sheriff had left them once, then twice, but whispers travelled quickly across plains. Elias knew men would not forget, and Nia sensed it too. One evening, as they walked by the creek, she asked him to show her more, how to aim faster, how to reload without shaking. He agreed, though it pained him to think she needed it. Together they practiced until dusk painted the sky crimson, her hands steady, her eyes fierce with resolve. He told her she was ready, and she answered with a faint smile, a smile carrying both defiance and peace. Their bond deepened in the face of that looming threat. One morning, as the sun spilled bright across the hills, Elias found her near the porch, braiding her hair. She looked up, the light catching her face, and he thought he had never seen anything so steady, so certain. He knelt before her, rough hands resting on her knees, and whispered the truth that had lived in him for weeks, that she was his home, the only place he would ever belong. Her fingers brushed his cheek, her eyes shining with unguarded love. She told him she had already chosen him, long before words had been spoken. In that moment, everything felt whole, and the healing power of their choice seemed to soak into the earth itself. But peace was never left untouched. The sound of hooves came again, louder this time, breaking across the valley like thunder. Elias lifted his rifle, his jaw set. Nia stood at his side, her hand briefly finding his arm before she moved to the doorway. The sheriff returned, not with 2 men, but with more, their horses restless, their eyes sharp. They called for her, demanded she be returned, said the town would not allow what they had built. Elias stepped forward, rifle steady, his voice calm but unyielding. He told them she would not go, that no law written in cruelty would claim her again. The sheriff demanded she speak. Nia did not hesitate. She walked onto the porch, barefoot upon the boards, her braid falling over her shoulder. Her voice rang clear, carrying across the yard. She would stay. No one owned her. No chain would ever bind her again. The men shifted, uncertain under the weight of her defiance. The sheriff's face hardened, but he saw the steadiness in both their stances, the unwavering line drawn. With a curt warning, he turned his horse, and the others followed. When silence returned, Elias lowered his rifle, his chest heaving though he had not fired a shot. Nia stepped to him, her hand pressing to his heart. She told him softly that he had risked everything for her, and he answered that it was no risk at all, because without her there was nothing worth keeping. She leaned into him, her body trembling not with fear, but with release, with the healing relief of having spoken her truth and lived. He held her there, the world shrinking to the sound of her heartbeat and the steady rhythm of his own. That night they sat by the fire, closer than ever. She poured coffee into his cup, her movements unhurried, her eyes calm. The firelight wrapped them both, and in its glow they felt not fugitives, not outcasts, but two people who had chosen love above all else. They touched hands across the table, their fingers entwining, and the silence that followed was rich with promise. Later, in bed, Elias held her as though she were not only a woman, but the very ground he had sought his whole life. Nia pressed her lips to his chest, to each scar, as though mending them with tenderness. He kissed her hair, her brow, her mouth, until their breaths tangled and the fire dimmed. Outside, the land stretched vast and indifferent, but inside the cabin, they lived within a circle of warmth, of healing, of love, strong enough to withstand whatever storm might come. When dawn rose pale, Elias woke to find her watching him, her eyes soft with certainty. She whispered that she was not afraid any more. He touched her face gently, and for the first time in years he believed the world could give something beautiful without taking it away. Together they rose to greet the day, their hands brushing, their steps aligned, and though shadows still lingered at the edges of the horizon, their love had become light enough to lead them through. The spring unfolded slowly, softening the land with green, washing away the last traces of frost. Buds appeared along the cottonwoods by the creek, small signs of life daring to return after months of silence. For Elias and Nia, each new bloom mirrored the quiet flowering of their own bond. What had begun in fear and uncertainty had become a rhythm of trust, of work shared and nights steeped in warmth. The cabin, once only a place of refuge for one weary man, now carried the pulse of two hearts, beating steady as the seasons shifted. They rose with the dawn. Nia stepped barefoot onto the porch, her braid brushing her back, her eyes drinking in the pale light spilling across the valley. Elias joined her, his arm settling gently around her shoulders, his presence solid as the earth beneath their feet. The world had not changed in its dangers. Towns still whispered, men still rode with suspicion, but their inner world had transformed. The air between them was no longer fragile. It was whole, filled with healing, alive with the certainty of belonging. Days stretched long with work. They tilled a small patch of soil near the cabin, planting beans and corn, their laughter rising as they knelt side by side in the dirt. She teased him when his rows wandered crooked, and he smiled at her stubborn determination to make every line straight. Sweat dampened their brows, but their hands moved with purpose. Their labor not only for survival, but as a promise to the future. Each seed pressed into the earth felt like a vow, that they would remain, that they would grow together. Afternoons often found them by the creek, where the water ran clear and cold from the hills. Nia would kneel to wash herbs, her reflection trembling on the surface, while Elias sat nearby, mending tack or carving wood. Sometimes they spoke of small things, the taste of the stew, the patterns of stars, but other times they spoke of what lay deeper. She told him she feared no longer the men who had once jeered her because she knew she was more than their cruelty. He told her that in her eyes he had found a redemption he thought lost forever. Their words fell soft, like petals upon water, but each one sank deep, filling the silence with meaning. Evenings were bathed in firelight. The cabin glowed golden, the hearth crackling, supper's scent mingling with the sweet smoke of pine. They sat close at the table, hands sometimes brushing, eyes lingering longer than before. She hummed the songs of her people, the melodies wrapping around the room like a cloak of comfort. He listened, his chest easing, his soul healed by the music. When the songs ended, he would take her hand, kiss her palm, and she would lean into him with quiet trust. Their nights were no longer marked by hesitation. They lay together with tenderness, bodies entwined, breaths aligned, hearts steady. His rough hands traced her skin as though each scar was a story he wanted to honor, not erase. Her lips touched the lines of his chest, healing years of sorrow with every kiss. The fire dimmed, the stars glimmered beyond the shuttered windows, but within their narrow bed the world became vast with love. Sleep came not as escape, but as gift. Their dreams laced together like threads of one fabric. Yet shadows still lingered. The sheriff had not returned since the last standoff, but Elias knew the threat of the town would never fully fade. They had been declared outcasts, their names likely cursed over drinks in the saloon. But when he looked at Nia across the table, when he felt her hand slip into his as they walked the pasture, he knew that exile was no punishment. It was freedom. To live outside of their judgment was to live truly, to build a life not of shame, but of choice. One evening, as the sun sank in streaks of crimson and gold, Elias stood with her on the porch. The land stretched wide, the horizon endless, the creek whispering in the distance. He turned to her, his hand finding her cheek, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. He told her she was his beginning and his end, the only home he had ever wanted. Her eyes shimmered, and she whispered that he was her freedom, her healing, her forever. Their kiss was slow, filled with the certainty of souls that had finally found what they had been searching for all along. The world around them would still turn, storms would still come, whispers would still travel. But within that cabin, love had taken root so deep no hand could tear it free. They had built a sanctuary where trust could grow, where wounds could mend, where two people could heal in each other's arms. And as the stars emerged one by one, Elias and Nia sat together by the fire, hands entwined, hearts steady. knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it side by side. If you have felt the warmth of their journey, let your heart share its voice. Leave a comment, let your thoughts flow, and if this story touched a healing part of you, I invite you to like and subscribe. Every gesture, no matter how small, helps keep the fire burning, carrying these stories forward into the night.